Thanks again to our sponsors, and especially our principal sponsor, Uniting Communities. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matt to deliver his keynote.
I just want to start, as we did yesterday, and acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Kaurna people. And I want to talk about dissociachotic, but I want to put it in the context where it came from, which is thinking about the non-psychosis that we share. So all the time we use the language of labels and creation of, somebody else's narrative over my experience. We other one another. We become one thing and they become another. And so often we don't give people a chance or an opportunity to move away from that othering, and we've been talking about this. So seeing the non-psychosis we share is the kind of core of that. That in my view, I would probably extend to the point that I don't think psychosis exists really, other than a word that we've made up. And that's really not denying any suffering or distress or anything that anybody else wants, but it's just saying, well, how do we stay in what really is? And I think that's through seeing a shared non-psychosis. So I'm just going to start by setting the scene for where I am, and I'm thinking that the interconnected that occurs through the process of growth within a loving, non-goal orientated relationship leads to a negation of the need for an altered state to exist. To defend the threat of annihilation or not existing. So when we genuinely come into interconnectedness, and that's based in a loving, non-goal orientated process between two people, then those extreme states don't need to be there. This is an intentionally evocative speech with the hope that people will agree or disagree. I don't really mind. It's about finding what works for you. And in this, you can then see that the wounded becomes the healer, which is what Oryx was talking about yesterday. And that provides a bridge for the helper. One of my biggest dreams and hopes, I suppose, is that one day we will look at people who have extreme states and be grateful, because we will actually understand more about ourselves and one another through the fact that some people have had to, or chosen to, or wanted to, or suffered with those extreme states. And then that really brings us into a space of meaning. That those of us like myself who've had these extreme distressing processes have gone beyond the suffering to find meaning in the actual experience. And in that, the helper then, in a non-psychotic state, can resist the attempt to change the legitimate reality of the person who is experiencing such a state. So that's the gift that we get, in my view, from the wounded person who themselves is actually potentially a healer. So in that context, then, I want to just discuss, and it's not going to be a real talk, which is probably a good thing, we're doing exercise, but I want to think about the principles that I've kind of developed in my mind and invite you to think of what might work for you or might not work for you. But when we're working with trauma and psychosis, and throughout this talk, if trauma's not your thing, you don't need it to be about trauma. If just noticing that there's a space of disconnection in your life and that's enough, that it's created distress, discomfort, extreme state, whatever, that's a legitimate thing as well. And I think there's a real risk when we talk about trauma and psychosis that everybody has to have experienced what everybody else thinks is trauma. So it's just an additional label that we layer on. So if you haven't experienced trauma, how can you experience the psychosis that Matt's talking about? Well, that's not what I'm saying. So really allowing people to sit in what is theirs, their narrative, and noticing where that might create a process in our sort of perceptual reality that's different to somebody else's. So what are the principles? There's something about spirituality and culture, and I used to put this at the end, and then I've kind of been musing on this, and I think that if we start in a place of understanding spirituality and culture, whatever that is for a person, then inherently takes us to a place of how that person defines their reality, who they are, what they are, how they experience, how they connected to this wonderful ground that we stand on, or the skies that we look at, or whatever. It's not about I'm a Christian, I'm a Buddhist, etc., etc. It's about the essence of us. I'm really keen on the work of Lauren Mascha, and the phrase "being with, not doing to" is an important phrase. But the story that I really love about the work of Lauren Mascha was when the person couldn't sleep in Soteria House, and so someone sat on the bed and held their hand. It feels beautiful. If you want to hold someone's hand now, if it's safe for you, it actually feels really nice. So you might want to try that, and it feels good. Joyce Travelbee is a mental health nursing theorist. Mental health nursing at its origin is very, very similar to peer work principles and values. If you look at the early theorists, you look at Gertrude Schwing, in the 1940s and 50s, it was said that she prepared people for the psychiatrists to do their wonderful work. But actually, when you read about it, what she did, she sat with people who were said to be catatonic and not able to engage, and they engaged with her. Through her sitting there, through being with someone. And Joyce Travelbee took that on and talked about the idea that if you're going to work with someone as a mental health nurse who's suffering and in distress, then the first 6 months are about finding a way that two human beings can just spend time together. Just be human together for 6 months. And we talk about rapport in the mental state examination as some sort of functional process. It's utter nonsense. And mental health nursing at its core has those values. So it's a really, as a mental health nurse, it's important for me to hold on to that when I see a lot of mental health nursing about being the opposite of that, which is disconnection, sticking needles in, doing tasks. If you're a mental health nurse, then you can let go of those things. Just read a bit of Travelbee. Seeing the non-psychosis we share, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but it's about finding the coexisting same experience. Creativity and openness, if you're going to work in these spaces, is vital because it'll remind you to connect to the other principles. Be available to what's happening. That's about moving me out of the way. It's what Oryx was saying about leaving my hat at the door. It's about coming into my heart, not in my head. I mean, we use our heads, that's okay, but what's it like if we sit in our hearts together? It's very beautiful, and it allows that creativity to come, and that sits in the empathy and compassion space. And then, what we've found at the Humane Clinic to be really useful is the tolerance of uncertainty, keeping that at the forefront of our mind. If you're going to work with someone who's in a state and you're accepting their state as different to something you're ever going to experience, then if you really want to be with them, because of the wider narratives of our society and community, you're going to have to tolerate uncertainty. And one of the things I see over and over in mental health services, particularly with people who are said to be psychotic, is that they became agitated or they became aggressive or they, so it turns out that standing up when you've got a lot of energy in your body might mean that you're being aggressive and more psychotic. But, I can model that for you. I got quite a lot of energy in my body. It's maybe not that threatening at times. Yeah.
Matt, I unfortunately had the experience of talking to a staff member who mentioned because someone wore makeup one day that they were probably manic.
Absolutely. Makeup and mania is intrinsically linked, absolutely. Unfortunately, but only in Victoria, it turns out. But we've got VMIAC here, so they're going to rectify that. If you can put that on your agenda for the election, makeup does not mean we'll take off the makeup, or if we want to be more adventurous, take off the light. I don't know. Exactly. My favourite thing on Barefoot Psychiatry, which is a Facebook page about bears eating feet and other unusual experiences. For psychosis, for schizophrenia. My favourite one on there was we did a talk one day and someone was very excited to talk to us and challenge some of our ideas. And the challenge that he wanted to give us was that he saw someone come off lamotrigine, and when we took this woman off the lamotrigine, she touched the psychotic membrane. Yeah. Seriously, I want to get back to seeing the non-psychosis. There's some principles, alongside the kind of principles of practice, there's a kind of theoretical underpinning. Shamelessly promoting my own theory and work, but right understanding, it comes from a Buddhist philosophy in my mind, and it's really important to me as a person who accepts some of the teachings. So right understanding, according to Lompo Samedo, is a state of accepting the reality of what is, understanding without intention to change. So we don't need to change it, we need to be with what is, without a goal and with the acceptance that the moment will, by the law of nature, pass. It will come and it will go. It may come again and it may go again. It may come again, it may go again. But if we can, our responsibility is to sit with that uncertainty, that difficulty. Because otherwise we start doing things to people, and there's your goal. Oryx and I were talking at the weekend about, Stephanie and I have gone into private practice, and not one person, despite the vehement desire for planning, and what's it called, care plans in public mental health and other services. There's an absolute passion for it. No one's ever asked me for a care plan outside of the system, ever. Now, I'm happy to plan with people, but no one's ever asked me for that. But if you go and sit in a public mental health service, it's a 3-monthly review of that plan. If I set a goal for someone, then that's my goal. It's the same as the label that I give them, it's my label. So we really need to be mindful. If you want to do goals with people, how do we make sure that those goals are A, something that person wants to do, and B, goals that person has? And I think, over the last few years, it's been quite radical, me saying this in the public mental health system. But, standing here right now, it doesn't feel very radical. So that's quite nice. And then the coexisting same experience is the kind of other part of the non-psychosis theory that I'm sort of playing with. And it's about, the coexisting same experience is about saying, I can sit in my reality that's different to your reality, but we can both consciously be aware of the difference, that's okay, and we can sit in it. And someone said to me yesterday, there's this chap we both know, and what do you understand what he says to you? Do you understand? I mean, I know you understand the words, but do you know what he's trying to articulate? And where we got to was that the last time I met with this chap, I sat for 40 minutes without speaking, and he just talked. And his feedback was that I'm a good listener. So if I'd had a goal, then I'd have been needing to work out what it was he was saying. But it didn't, what he wanted was for me to be present with him in that moment. Now, I didn't share his experiences of some of the technological processes that the government do to him. That's not my reality. I feel quite free of that stuff. But I was able to tell him that. He was able to tell me about it, and we coexisted without the need to change one another's states, which just feels quite important to me. And in that's when we get to non-psychosis. Neither of us are psychotic. We just have a unique experience, and it's not new. You'll all have heard it in different ways, but this is my way of thinking about it. So I'm going to come on to my explanatory framework. I'm not proposing a new label. It's really important, but one of the gifts, and I'm not asking people in extreme states to help others, but the byproduct of people inviting you to walk with them in their extreme state is, as the helper and the supporter, you do get taught. And we touched yesterday on the dangers of this and that, but I'm talking about, in the moment, the person giving me guidance. I'm not talking about me making something better or something right for somebody else. And that's an incredible gift in my life when I have that opportunity. So just hold in mind, I'm not asking you to take on yet another label of this miserable system, but I do want you to contemplate that my thing about labels is that when I tell you have a disorder, it's my label that I've given. It's not your label to take on. You can choose. Now, that's not how our system works, but that's where I want us the system to get. It's okay for a psychiatrist to tell me I have narcissistic personality disorder or schizophrenia or depression or psychotic depression or drug-induced depression. Those were 5 of them. But they're the labels of somebody who's studied a lot about this book. This book, in the introduction, tells you it doesn't stand up legally. So you read a DSM, go and get a DSM. It says in there, in the foreword, it doesn't stand up legally. So those labels belong to someone else. So moving on to Dissociachotic, I just want to quote the wonderful Noel Hunter. If you don't know of Noel Hunter and trauma, psychosis and dissociation, it's just a beautifully written book. So she says, I do not believe it is possible to separate psychosis and dissociation. To me, this is like attempting to separate a headache and a fever when I have the flu. Where does the headache begin and the fever end? And should I focus on treating my headache, fever, or maybe the virus that infected me and is creating an interconnected process of events in my body? While psychosis and dissociation are not the same thing, I believe that one does not have psychosis without dissociation or dissociation without psychosis. And here's the thing. Often, the difference simply boils down to who can frame things the way the professional wants to hear or agrees with. And for any of us that have touched the system here, we probably know what she's talking about. So my explanatory model, not a label, is called Dissociachotic. I have a hat with it on that my daughter wears. One of the things I want to propose, I used to think it was an individual thing, but actually it's a systemic thing as well. So you can very easily see when the system is in a systemic state of dissociachotic. It can't quite stay in its consciousness of its responsibility and process. So it goes into this kind of awkward, bizarre language where people be put in double binds. So putting someone in a double bind would be a systemic form of dissociachotic reality. And we wouldn't do it if we were consciously doing it and realise what we were doing. So we've lost primary awareness as a systemic approach when we create double binds for people. So dissociachotic, the experience of animation and giving life, so it's an active process, and I'll explain why this is difficult for us to understand, to being at variance of companionship to ourselves. So we've separated ourselves off from ourselves in order for the survival of self in relation to to interpersonal threat from the other. So we've got this incredibly skillful mind and soul and body that can separate itself off when the threat from another person is too much, and we can be separated away from that. But what we think of then normally is dissociation as this kind of flattening out, disappearing, not being present. But that's not the case. And my hypothesis is that psychosis is actually what Stephanie referred to when I was making up this word, was busy active dissociation. And this is the problem. So we think of dissociation as shutting down, freezing, not being present like that. But actually, we know now in dissociative states, people's frontal lobes are very able to do a multitude of tasks. So that what I'm suggesting is that psychosis is just an expression overtly of this. And it creates awkwardness for us because our perception is that people should be shutting down when actually they're becoming animated. The important part of this is that when we recognise this and we can shift our thinking away from, here's an ill person who's psychotic and overwhelmed, dangerous, scary, whatever, and we can say, this is a person who primarily has got an experience of being separated because in the here and now I feel threatened, then we can attune to what happened in that relationship, that environment, that space, and create an environment where people can come back into connection. And it fits well with ReAwaken. So my theoretical concept is that the reason why we can't understand psychosis as more of a dissociative experience is because you've just got a perceptual framework that it's an illness, and they're so similarly related. So I just want to tie it into a theory, so it's not just Matt Ball's formerly psychotic theories. So where I'm suggesting here is that if you look at polyvagal theory, where we have social engagement as the primary mechanism of creating safety, and if that doesn't work, we go into mobilization and then into immobilization. What I'm suggesting in this theory is that the social engagement encounter in the so-called psychotic state, people just flick into this busy active dissociation to protect against the threat response. So it's a dissociative response in that space. I can extrapolate later. So what does it look like in reality? Once upon a time we were humans and animals. We did very primal things. There was an animal that was bigger than the human. The animal runs after its prey. The person tries to fight it. It doesn't work. The person tries to run away. It doesn't work. The person lies flat. And because of the innate response of the animal, it runs past because it wants to chase and get down its prey. Hence we survive in that freeze sort of state. Then we grew a frontal lobe and it started working more effectively. And the threat changed. The threat is now from people, not animals. We try and fight people, and our society doesn't generally accept that and allow that. So we try and run away. Just a fact for you, if you get detained in South Australia in a democratic society that we live in, we've now, under the new Mental Health Act provision, you can be treated under your detention criteria in another state. That's undemocratic.
And we'll also do reverse.
And we will reciprocate that to the undemocratic purveyors. So we try and run away. It doesn't work because of that. So if we lie flat, what happens? The animal would run past us, but it's no longer the animal. So humans have this desire and propensity to try and create betterness for somebody else. So if we lie flat, people come and do things to us. So what we've done is we've created this perceptual awareness that that's going to happen. And my hypothesis is that instead of lying flat, we now create these extreme realities and we express them. And for most people, if somebody is standing on the street shouting at voices that other people can't see, they go to the other side of the road and move around them. And what it does is, if we go back, it's the same thing as lying flat, but it's just an externalized version of that. And that's why we have a problem with the perception of it. What does it do? I mean, if we see what's happening between me and the other person, we can be attuning to what we've done that's been a threat to the other person, or what the environment's done. And that's a real key for me, because actually we can then bring that into the room with people and invite them to explore that with us, or us to explore that with them, so that we can consider whether we want to reverse what we've been doing that's created this need to separate off, or whether we want to tolerate it and see that we can tolerate and be skillful and powerful in various different ways. So if we respond to psychosis as dissociation, and I'm not saying you have to believe it's dissociation, but the theoretical concept is more legitimate to think of it as dissociation in my view. So when we're in this moment and I'll read an example in a minute, and someone appears to suddenly become more psychotic, your responsibility as a supporter might be to see what's just happened. It might be nuanced, it might be moment-based, it might be more broad, it might be the sort of the language you've used, it might be you crossed your leg, And that, for some reason, was enough to trigger someone into a response of, oh, where's the relationship now? And then our job is to then not go further towards them, but to allow someone to come towards us when they're ready. So what we do as human beings, somebody's suffering and we want to make it better. Now, in the therapy room, that's a bit like moving slightly towards them, going closer, closer. What I'm saying is, stay where you are, or even move back to where you were, and invite them to tell you what it was like when I just did this. Oh, and when I do that, oh, that feels right. Okay, so then it was me, and it's not them. It's not them that's the problem. It's the relationship that's come and gone. We notice what the threat was, and if we go towards them rather than waiting for them to come to us, we're going to push people into liminality. And people in liminality become more creative, more ritualistic, and yes, look more psychotic. So the further we go to try and correct what's happened in that moment, the more we're pushing people in that moment towards those extreme states, which we then decide we need to do something about. And so that's where the theory of non-psychosis comes in. If we accept the legitimacy of the person's reality in this moment of interconnectedness, there was a threat or a vulnerability, what we're saying is that we acknowledge both of those positions, the two of us, if there's three of you in the room, the three of us, and we say that we are now in a coexisting same experience. We can move gently with one another to see where the safety comes and where the safety goes. And that's a very beautiful space to be in. And for me personally, it was a very beautiful space to find myself in when I was so-called psychotic. That actually, when people stopped paying attention to me being the problem and my expression being the problem, my problem didn't seem such a problem. And you know, I haven't got time, but I learned this living in a community of so-called psychotic people that weren't getting better from the wonderful treatments. And we didn't talk about psychosis, we didn't talk about risk, we spent time in community. And it was pretty simple. So I just want to read you through a dissociachotic example. 30-year-old guy, Jack, has been hearing voices, a number of voices, experiencing thought blocking, thought insertion as the language is, for around 7 years, and also quite a lot of paranoia and other unusual spiritual related experiences. The particular voice we were dialoguing with, and there was three of us in the room, had been very pervasive and aggressive, and often was, content-wise, nature-wise, just not very nice. I had my own ideas, he had his own ideas, the third therapist, Steph, had her own ideas, you know, and we talked about that. We worked that through as a shared formulative space. And Jack had invited us to engage with his voices. We were probably in the 15th session of talking with voices, and the session had been going on for a while, and what happened was, there's intentional language, he was functioning well, whatever that means. And then I said to him, I asked him if he might ask a question of this particular voice, and it was a voice that represented a distinct emotional distress in his life. And I asked him to talk direct to the voice, as had been the setup. And it was absolutely phenomenal. We've been engaging, to-fro, three-way dialogue, and suddenly he starts going, and you could see the voice was getting louder. In psychiatric language, he was thought blocked, he wasn't able to process. And so then the second facilitator asked him the same question, and it just carried on. And then we noticed what was happening, and we said, oh, you don't have to answer that. Was that difficult? And we could step back from there. And he steps back in the room and he goes, oh yeah, thanks, yeah, I can't do that. You know, so what we'd seen then in psychiatric or psychosis perspective was an increase in psychotic phenomena in the moment. That's not how psychosis and schizophrenia works as a biological concept. But that's what we'd seen, an increase in psychotic phenomena, including increase in voices, thought blocking, cognitive impairment, and he was acutely psychotic on chronic schizophrenia. You know, that's what we might say. That's the sort of language, if you've never had the displeasure of seeing this stuff. From a dissociachotic framework, what we might think is that the request by the facilitator inviting Jack to take an action that was overtly challenging led to the difficulty in processing the dilemma that represents the previous and current emotional distress and conflict. The facilitator had, through his action of invoking an emotional conflict, created a threat within the human-to-human encounter, and that resulted in what we then call the psychotic phenomena. As we step back from that, he came back into connection. This guy is not psychotic. So that's an example. Schizoaffective disorder. Now, I'm not meaning to dismiss anybody's label that they want to own, right? But if you have schizoaffective disorder, it means that you have schizophrenia, but you have depression or elevated mood.
You might be wearing makeup.
You like wearing makeup. But if you have schizophrenia, you might have extreme moods of some form. So I want to give another example. This happened in a high dependency unit in a hospital in Adelaide, and I've got Mick's permission to share this story, of course. It's going to be published soon. Mick was in an acute hospital as an involuntary consumer. Those of you that aren't from Australia, he was detained. Having been placed in a secure ward, upon discussion with a psychiatrist, he expressed the voices were telling him to kill people in the ward, including the psychiatrist and the nurses. Mick verbalising the content of the voices to the psychiatrist led to his detention. Prior to this, Mick had been openly discussing his voices with a nurse that would later be invited back in to spend time with Mick after he was detained. The conversation had included the same content, but had not raised alarm for the nurse to consider detaining Mick, due to the nurse taking an acceptance and meaning-based approach to understanding the voice hearing. During the conversation, the psychiatrist was also making various threats, so I would say articulating his fears in the direction of other individuals who were residing in the ward. He thought other people were going to harm him. A nurse with an interest in spending time with psychosis as a way of allowing it to appear or not appear, as is the functional need of the individual, was invited to speak with Mick. As the process of the therapeutic encounter unfolded, Mick began to describe the phenomena. As Mick articulated the range of voices, visions and auras he was experiencing, he referred to the voice directing him to kill the nurse that was relating with him. Mick was sitting in a relaxed posture on a comfortable chair and was facing directly to the nurse. The nurse was not experiencing any sense of threat, but instead was interested to understand more about the experience. The nurse articulated his sense of feeling safe, despite the voices giving direction to Mick. Two significant considerations were made by the nurse and explicitly explored by Mick. One, do you want to kill me? Do you personally want to kill me? He said no. What does it feel like to hear a voice saying that you should want to kill someone when you don't want to hurt that person? And in this context, it was particularly important because we knew each other for 6 months. Mick was clear in stating that he did not wish to hurt or intend to kill the nurse, despite hearing a voice expressing this view. He immediately became distressed and upset at the sadness that the nurse might think Mick would want to harm him. He began to weep. He expressed that he felt guilt and shame in hearing voices instructing him to hurt someone he cared about, who was demonstrating safety towards him. It was a really, really powerful moment in a high dependency unit. The next thing that happened was I said to Mick, what do you want to happen now? And he said, could I have a hug? So we stood up and we hugged. And he cried and he cried and he cried. And we stood there while he cried on me, as an unpsychotic person who'd just been detained for so-called psychosis. Gosh. Anyway, about 6 months later, Mick would say to me, you know that moment when we hugged and we cried? There was nothing happening. There was no voices. And this is what I'm talking about. When we come into connection and we create safety and we invite the other person to tell us what that feels like and how that needs to happen, as Oryx was telling us yesterday, then these extreme states might just not need to exist. Because we're talking about addiction and trauma, and I'll wrap it up, I want to introduce a new word, dissociaddiction. It's the first time. It's a brand of ReAwaken. So I made this up this week after discussing it with PJ. But in all seriousness, it's a hypothesis. It's a way of describing and creating an explanation. But Andrew Tatarsky talks about the urge as the axis of change. And I suppose I really value that in addiction. So there's this kind of space for change to occur in that kind of surging, urging thing. But I suppose what I want to say is that I agree with that, but only if we understand what might be happening. And I wonder if we apply the same logic, anyone who's ever used drugs in a ritualistic way or spent time with someone that has, there's quite an incredible ritualistic process of engaging with that experience. You know, whether it's scoring, whether it's preparing, whether it's gathering to get that process underway. It's quite wonderful in terms of the energy that the person has in it, and lots of skill. And so I suppose my hypothesis in the dissociaddiction space is that this is going to occur when we lose connection with whatever it is we feel safe about. Often I'm thinking a person, but if it's not, if it's the environment, we're going to move into a dissociaddictive, it's another new word, dissociaddictive space where we lose primary consciousness over, oh, I'm going to find safety over here, and we move into that functional dissociation where we've still got access to the frontal lobes to process, but we lose connection and consciousness with others and our environment around us. And I think what I really like about this in my head is that what does a person need in that moment? And we don't necessarily know, but if we use the compassion-focused therapy approach and we think about the threat and the drive being changed, so when the threat increases, the unsafety increases, the drive reduces towards safety, maybe. What do we need to bring the drive back into connection, back on? We need soothing. And having worked in heroin communities, there is an explicit and overt mirror that when we induce opiates into our system, people feel safe again. And in the compassion-focused model, what do we do when we soothe ourselves? We increase the endogenous opiates and oxytocin to bring back the drive and reduce the threat. And so this is where I think that we need to much more clearly understand the drives in those processes and think about how we can support the person to soothe by coming back into connection, instead of seeing their behaviours as in some way disruptive or dysfunctional. So just to summarise, I've gone way over, as everyone has, so I don't feel too bad. The disconnection, just to summarise, the psychotic person may be in a state of feeling unsafe due to the action or being in relation to another person. As the individual cannot change the fact of another person existing, they change their own state unconsciously. The energy of this state serves to stave off complete annihilation, non-existence, of their existence and soul, but does leave them in a liminal space in the world. At this point, the psychosis can become exacerbated, or the dissociachotic state, as the individual navigates the liminal space of existence and non-existence. So now we're talking deeply about everything that we are, and we're back to spirit and culture for me. The connection, well, with the acceptance that the non-psychotic experience becomes a river through which transition might flow to deeper interconnectedness. So if we can see the process not as something aberrant and different, that's the bridge where we maintain and build on our interconnectedness. Thank you.